The night begins in silence. The air of Sparta is thick with the scent of olive oil and iron. A young woman kneels by a dying fire, her hair shorn from her head. Her scalp burns from the cold as her attendants wrap her in a coarse, masculine cloak. Tonight, she is not meant to look like a bride. She is meant to look like a man. There are no songs, no laughter, no warmth of family. Only ritual. She is left alone in a dark room. Outside, her new husband is not a man of tenderness, but a warrior, trained from boyhood to suppress every emotion. Soon he will enter, silently, without ceremony, to claim what the state says is his duty. This is not a wedding night. It is a state operation disguised as intimacy. The Spartans were not like any other people of ancient Greece. To them, love was weakness, desire was distraction, and the body was a weapon forged for war. Every act, even that of marriage, served the same god, the god of strength. This was a city where newborns were inspected for flaws, where children were raised in barracks, and where women were expected to bear sons, not emotions. The state owned the flesh of its citizens, and that ownership extended into the bedroom. What we call a union, they called a function. But beneath that ritual of control was something darker, more psychological. The bride's transformation, the shaving of her head, the loss of her femininity, was more than symbolic. It was erasure. It was a warning that in Sparta, individuality did not exist. The perfect Spartan woman was not a person, she was a vessel. Her identity dissolved into the collective body of the state, just as her body would be offered up for the creation of new soldiers. Every gesture was choreographed to strip away softness and remind her that even in her most private moment, the eyes of Sparta watched. Imagine the silence of that room. No music, no priest, no gentle voice to break the tension. Only the sound of breathing, his and hers, in the dark. For him, this was not love. It was another battlefield. For her, it was obedience. The union that followed would decide not just a life, but a lineage. And yet, in that silence, something far deeper unfolds, the collision between human instinct and a culture that feared it. This story is not only about one night. It is about what happens when a civilization seeks to control the most intimate corners of human existence. When the state dictates desire, love becomes rebellion. And in Sparta, rebellion was a death sentence. This opening night, this ritual that robbed women of identity and men of tenderness, reveals the paradox at the heart of Sparta's legend. A society so obsessed with strength that it mutilated its own soul. The question that haunts history is not simply what they did, but why? Why would a people celebrated for their discipline and valor turn marriage into a ritual of suppression? The answer lies deep within their psychology, in a fear more powerful than any enemy. The fear of weakness, of emotion, of losing control. What began as a quest for perfection became a war against nature itself. As the fire fades and the night closes around the trembling bride, the film's journey begins. We step through the veil of myth into a world where strength is sacred, tenderness is treason, and love itself must kneel before the state. This is Sparta, not the one of heroism and glory, but the one history tried to forget. The one where, on the most intimate night of all, humanity was conquered in the name of perfection. The city of Sparta did not rise upon love or beauty, but upon fear, obedience, and blood. To understand what happened on that haunting wedding night, one must first step inside the mind of a Spartan, a world where affection was weakness, and discipline was the only virtue worth dying for. Sparta was not merely a city, it was a machine. Every breath, every movement, every life existed for one purpose, to serve the state. From the moment a child took its first breath, its fate was sealed by laws that valued strength over everything human. A newborn was carried to the elders, examined like livestock, and if found wanting, left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. Mercy had no place here. Only perfection. The Spartans believed that their survival depended on the purity of their warrior bloodline. They lived surrounded by enemies, enslaved helots who vastly outnumbered them, rival Greek states who envied them, and a natural world as harsh as their laws. Fear became their religion, and discipline their salvation. Every citizen was a soldier, every woman a breeder of soldiers, every act of life part of a sacred war machine. To love too deeply was to forget duty. To seek pleasure was to betray the collective. They trained themselves not to feel. The agoge, Sparta's brutal education system, began when boys were just 7 years old. Torn from their mothers, they were thrown into a world of cold, hunger, and pain. They learned to steal, to fight, to kill, and above all, to endure. They were beaten not for failing but for being caught showing weakness. Compassion was mocked, suffering was sacred. By the time a man reached adulthood, he belonged more to his brothers in arms than to any woman who might one day call herself his wife. The barracks were his home, his comrades his family, his sword his companion. Marriage, in this world, was not the joining of hearts. It was a political arrangement, a reproductive duty. And yet, Sparta was a paradox. While its men lived lives of enforced submission to the state, its women stood in strange contrast to the rest of Greece. Elsewhere, women were cloistered and silent, but Spartan women ran, trained, and even competed in athletic games. They spoke freely, owned land, and managed estates while their husbands fought. To outsiders, they seemed powerful, even liberated. But this freedom was not born of equality, it was born of necessity. The men were always away at war, and the city could not function without its women. Their strength was practical, not personal. Their independence existed only within the boundaries of the state's design. The Spartan woman was expected to be strong not for herself, but for her womb. She was to bear the healthiest sons, to nurture warriors who would one day kill and die without hesitation. Even her beauty was measured in utility: broad hips, strong limbs, firm flesh. She was the mother of soldiers, not a partner in love. Her body was a factory of strength, and her marriage a transaction between the state and nature itself. The tenderness of a lover had no place here. The state chose strength over sentiment, and in doing so, redefined womanhood into something both powerful and tragic. The society's laws reflected this philosophy. The great lawgiver Lycurgus designed a system in which every act of life served the same god, the god of control. Luxury was banned. Gold and silver were outlawed. Even words were disciplined. Spartans spoke in short, cutting sentences, where meaning was sharp and emotion absent. Theirs was a world stripped bare of excess, a civilization sculpted in stone and silence. If Athens was poetry, Sparta was punishment. In this world, love was dangerous. It distracted, softened, and corrupted the mission. A Spartan man could not live with his wife until he reached the age of 30, and even then he slept most nights in the barracks with his comrades. Husbands would sneak into their wives' rooms in darkness, fulfill their duty, and vanish before dawn. The state demanded secrecy, as if love were a crime. Marriage was permitted only because the city needed children, not because it approved of affection. To the Spartans, passion was an enemy of order. Desire was a wildfire that could burn through the structure they had built with such cruelty and precision. So they turned marriage into a ritual of restraint. The man would approach his bride as a soldier approached an enemy fortress, swiftly, silently, without pleasure, without vulnerability. She, stripped of her beauty and femininity, became the embodiment of the state's will, genderless, obedient, and strong. And yet, beneath this iron order, the human heart still beat. The same men who killed without hesitation still carried within them the capacity to long, to remember softness, to yearn for what their system had forbidden. The same women who shouted strength into their sons' ears still wept quietly when the torches went out. But Sparta had no room for such things. Emotion was a private sin. Compassion was treason. This section reveals the psychological foundation that made the marriage ritual possible. The state's fear of weakness infected every part of life, turning love into a liability. In Sparta, strength was the only virtue that mattered, not the strength of heart, but the strength of the hand. Their civilization was built on the denial of human softness, and yet that very denial became their undoing. For no society can survive forever by silencing the voice of its own humanity. The ceremony that awaited a Spartan bride was unlike any other in the ancient world. There were no garlands of flowers, no music, no gathering of friends to celebrate a union. There was only the sound of a blade scraping across the scalp, the sound of identity being stripped away. Her long hair, the symbol of femininity and youth, fell to the ground in clumps. She did not protest. She could not. From that moment onward, she ceased to exist as herself. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a maiden. She was property of the state, reshaped to fulfill one sacred purpose, to bear the next generation of soldiers. In Sparta, the act of shaving the bride's head was not merely symbolic, it was ideological. It represented the destruction of individuality, of softness, of everything that made a woman distinct from a man. By forcing her to resemble a male, to wear his cloak, his sandals, even his scent, the Spartans created a creature that was neither woman nor man, but something in between, a vessel of strength purified of emotion. Her new appearance was meant to erase lust and sentimentality, to make the act of consummation feel less like passion and more like discipline. The wedding night became a ritual of psychological control, not pleasure. The bride was then dressed in a rough tunic, the same kind worn by the young warriors of Sparta. The fabric scratched against her bare skin, the air of the room cool against her scalp. No one spoke. The attendants extinguished the torches, plunging the chamber into darkness. Outside, the men of the city were feasting or training, their laughter echoing faintly through the streets. But within the walls of that room, silence reigned, heavy, oppressive, absolute. The bride sat motionless, waiting. She did not know when he would come. Only that he would. When the groom entered, he did so as a soldier entering an enemy camp. There was no ceremony, no tenderness, no sign of affection. He came in secrecy, guided only by memory and instinct. He was forbidden to live with his wife, forbidden to dine with her, forbidden even to be seen approaching her. The law demanded that their encounters remain hidden, as if intimacy itself were a crime against the state. What transpired in those nights was less a joining of souls and more a ritual submission to the collective will. To modern eyes, it is a scene of horror. But to the Spartans it was sacred. They believed that the act of stripping away femininity made the union more efficient, more pure. The husband was trained to see his wife not as a companion, but as an extension of the Spartan ideal, strong, silent, unyielding. The shaving of the bride's head symbolized that he was not uniting with a fragile woman, but with a partner in discipline, a female soldier whose purpose was to continue the bloodline of warriors. Love was weakness. Efficiency was divine. Ancient writers like Plutarch describe the ritual in chilling detail. They suggest that the practice may have originated as a test of endurance, a psychological exercise that reminded men to control desire as they controlled fear. By disguising women as men, Sparta transformed the wedding bed into another training ground for emotional restraint. The young warrior was expected to conquer his instincts, to approach his wife with the same detachment he would show on the battlefield. Passion was tolerated only when it served the purpose of creation. But beneath this calculated cruelty lay something far more complex, the fear of the feminine. Spartan ideology glorified masculinity to such an extreme that femininity became a threat. To them, the softness of women represented the chaos of emotion, the unpredictable power of life itself. By shaving the bride's head and wrapping her in a man's cloak, the ritual symbolically neutralized that threat. The woman became safe, controlled, depersonalized, manageable. In their pursuit of absolute order, the Spartans declared war on nature itself. For the bride, the transformation was more than physical, it was spiritual annihilation. Her wedding night was not a celebration of love but a surrender of self. Every strand of hair that fell to the floor marked a piece of her identity lost to the will of the city. She belonged not to her husband, not even to her family, but to Sparta. Her body was a resource, her womb a national treasure. If she bore strong sons, she would be honored. If she bore weak ones, she would be shamed, perhaps even scorned as cursed. Her entire worth was reduced to what she could give the state. And yet, within this mechanical cruelty, there existed moments of haunting humanity. Some accounts suggest that over time, affection did grow between certain husbands and wives, small rebellions of the heart hidden in the shadows. A whispered word, a hand lingering a moment too long, the silent acknowledgement of shared captivity. These gestures were dangerous, almost subversive. To care was to defy the system that demanded emotional death. In this way, the ritual of the shaved bride reveals the deepest paradox of Spartan life. The same culture that worshipped discipline could not completely extinguish desire. The same state that tried to sculpt perfect citizens could not control the beating heart. The ritual itself, so cold, so deliberate, was proof of their fear. They feared that love, if left unchecked, would weaken the iron will upon which their empire stood. And perhaps they were right. For love is a force that refuses to obey. When the husband finally leaves, the bride lies alone in the darkness. The room smells of oil and sweat and smoke. Outside, the city sleeps beneath its laws, unaware that somewhere inside its perfect machinery, two broken humans have just fulfilled their duty. In that silence lies the essence of Sparta, a world that believed it could conquer even the heart. The husband's approach was not that of a man meeting his wife but of a soldier entering enemy ground. The night was quiet, heavy with the smell of oil lamps and sweat-soaked linen. In that silence, footsteps echoed like distant drums of war. The man moved through shadows, forbidden to be seen, forbidden even to speak of what he was about to do. This secrecy was not accidental. It was the very essence of Spartan marriage. The union between man and woman was designed not for love, but for the preservation of discipline. Even in the act of consummation, the state's hand guided every movement. The Spartan husband had lived his entire youth in the agoge, the state-run barracks where boys learned to suppress every trace of emotion. From the age of 7, he had been beaten, starved, and conditioned to believe that desire was dangerous. His loyalty belonged not to a woman but to the brotherhood, to the men who trained beside him, to the commanders who shaped his body into a weapon. To love another human being too deeply was to weaken that loyalty. And so, even on his wedding night, he approached not with tenderness, but with caution. His wife was not his partner, she was an assignment, a duty, a quiet battlefield. He would come at night, cloaked in silence. There was no candlelight, no ritual blessing. He entered her chamber like a thief. In the darkness, he found her, a figure neither fully woman nor fully man, her head shaven, her face hidden. The silence between them was not intimacy but obedience. He would lie beside her briefly, their union more mechanical than passionate, then vanish before dawn. By day, he returned to his barracks, to his brothers, to his state. For weeks, months, even years, this pattern continued. Marriage in Sparta was a secret act, carried out in whispers and shadows, as if the natural bond between man and woman were something to be ashamed of. This secrecy had a purpose. It was meant to train men to control their impulses, to make them soldiers even in love. Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver of Sparta, believed that desire must be tempered, that longing made a man weak. By forcing husbands and wives to meet in secret, he ensured that passion never became routine. Every encounter was brief, intense, and contained. The city believed this would strengthen both body and will, preventing love from dulling the warrior's spirit. But beneath this system of control lay deep contradictions. The more Sparta tried to suppress emotion, the more it revealed its fear of it. The very laws that forbade affection admitted its power. They knew that love could undo even the most disciplined soldier, that tenderness could erode the hardness of the Spartan ideal. So they hid it, like a secret that could destroy the entire machine. The husband, no matter how hardened by training, could not always silence the beating of his heart. The wife, no matter how conditioned to obedience, could not fully extinguish the instinct to yearn. Their union, though designed as function, carried within it the ghost of forbidden humanity. Imagine the moment he enters her room. The moonlight spills faintly through the cracks of the wooden door, illuminating her shaved head, her trembling hands. He hesitates, not from fear of her, but from fear of himself. For a heartbeat, he remembers that before he was a soldier, he was a man. She looks up, and for that fleeting instant, the walls of discipline crack. It is there, in that unspoken recognition, that the tragedy of Sparta truly lives. A civilization that demanded its people deny the most human parts of themselves. And yet, for all its cruelty, this ritual bound them together in a strange and silent way. The secrecy gave their union a weight it might not have otherwise had. Each encounter carried the tension of duty and danger, of forbidden closeness. Some historians believe that this strange system, of hiding, of longing, of brief, charged meetings, made Spartan marriages unexpectedly strong once men reached the age of 30 and were finally allowed to live with their wives. The years of restraint, of stolen moments, created bonds that even war could not easily break. In denying them love, Sparta may have deepened it, though at terrible cost. To outsiders, such as Athenians and Persians, this way of life was unthinkable. They mocked Sparta's lack of affection, its cold efficiency. But the Spartans saw it as sacred order. Where Athens built temples to Aphrodite, goddess of love, Sparta worshipped Enyalius, god of war. Even the bed became a battlefield. The husband was trained to conquer not his wife's heart, but his own desire. The state's message was clear. A true Spartan must never surrender, not even to love. But in the stillness after he leaves, the illusion of control fades. The bride lies alone, her shaved head against the rough linen. The smell of iron and sweat lingers. Outside, the night hums with the rhythm of marching feet, of training swords clashing in the dark. She knows he will return, not tonight perhaps, but soon, always in silence, always in shadow. And with each visit, she loses a little more of herself to a system that calls itself perfect. This is the heart of the Spartan paradox, a society that worshipped strength but feared connection. In its obsession with power, it turned love into duty, tenderness into obedience, and marriage into another instrument of control. The husband's approach was never about passion or trust. It was about survival within a system that demanded emotion be buried beneath armor. Yet in the darkness of those nights, amid the whispers of restraint, the ancient human truth endured, that no law, no training, no state can fully kill the need to be seen, touched, and known. To understand why the Spartans designed such a disturbing ritual for their brides, we must strip away the surface of brutality and look at the purpose beneath it. Sparta's obsession with control did not end at the battlefield, it extended into the womb. Marriage in this society was not an expression of affection or partnership, but a biological contract orchestrated by the state. Every wedding, every night of forced intimacy, was a calculated act in a larger campaign, the production of perfect warriors. The citizens of Sparta were not born for themselves, they were engineered for the collective. From birth to death, the body in Sparta belonged to the polis. The city-state viewed its citizens as parts of a single organism, and reproduction was the process by which it renewed itself. The union of husband and wife was thus not a personal decision but a civic duty. Love, choice, attraction, these were indulgences of weaker nations. A Spartan's only purpose was to strengthen the state. The husband was expected to plant his seed as he wielded his spear, efficiently, dispassionately, without hesitation. The wife, in turn, was expected to receive him not as a lover but as a vessel of the state's will. This philosophy was rooted in a ruthless form of eugenics. The Spartans believed that only the strongest bodies should create life, and only the fittest children should survive. The city conducted a quiet, ongoing experiment on its own people, an experiment in selective breeding centuries before modern science gave such cruelty a name. Physical perfection was treated as moral virtue, weakness as sin. The result was a society that viewed reproduction not as sacred intimacy, but as a duty to perfection. To bear a child was to forge a weapon for Sparta's defense. To bear a weak child was to shame the gods. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Xenophon describe this ideology in reverent detail, as if it were divine wisdom. Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, was said to have crafted the laws so that marriage served military ends. Older men were encouraged to share their wives with younger, stronger men if it meant producing better offspring. Love was irrelevant, only the outcome mattered. A woman's fidelity was measured not by emotion but by utility. The idea of romantic exclusivity, so cherished in other Greek cities, was alien here. What mattered was the next generation of soldiers. It is difficult for the modern mind to grasp such logic without horror. The intimacy of the human bond, the small tendernesses that define love, all of it was stripped away, replaced by cold arithmetic. The state was the true husband, the citizens were merely its instruments. In this system, even desire itself was weaponized. Men were encouraged to cultivate lust, but only in service to the polis. Their longing was not personal, it was patriotic. To desire one's wife was to desire the continuation of Sparta's strength. Even passion was permitted only when it could be converted into purpose. The Spartan woman, meanwhile, bore a strange duality of power and enslavement. She was respected, even honored, for her role in the survival of the city. Her body was trained, her voice heard, her existence visible in ways unthinkable elsewhere in Greece. Yet that power was hollow. It existed only within the boundaries of her reproductive utility. Her beauty, her intelligence, her will, all were secondary to her womb's success. The greatest praise a Spartan woman could receive was not for her mind or virtue, but for the strength of her sons. The cruel irony was that in a city where women could own land, they could not own themselves. There is something deeply psychological in this obsession. The Spartan state's control of marriage and childbirth was an attempt to conquer the most uncontrollable force of all, nature. Love, desire, and fertility are wild, unpredictable, and deeply human. But Sparta's entire philosophy was built on the denial of chaos. The human body, like the human heart, was to be trained, ordered, perfected. In this sense, the marriage ritual was a mirror of the Spartan soul. Beauty erased, identity buried, function elevated above feeling. The ritual was not about cruelty for its own sake. It was about the fear of losing control, of surrendering to what cannot be governed. The consequences of this ideology were immense. It created generations of men who viewed intimacy as obligation and women who saw themselves as tools of destiny. Emotional connection was not just undervalued, it was dangerous. To love one's wife too deeply was to invite softness. To mourn too long was to waste time better spent training. In this way, the Spartan system devoured its own humanity. It produced warriors without tenderness, mothers without peace, and marriages without joy. And yet, even in such darkness, the human spirit found ways to resist. There are whispers in ancient texts of Spartan couples who defied the rules, who found affection in the shadows. Some husbands refused to share their wives, choosing devotion over doctrine. Some women risked their reputations to choose their lovers rather than obey the arrangements made by the state. These small acts of rebellion were rare, but they prove something profound, that no matter how total the system, love finds a way to survive. In the grand design of Sparta's perfection, the purpose of marriage was never union, it was production. The city sought to breed a race of unbreakable warriors, but in doing so, it broke the spirit of its own people. Each wedding was a transaction between flesh and ideology, each child a tribute to the gods of discipline. What began as a method to ensure strength became a symbol of how far a civilization will go to conquer its own humanity. When we look back at this system now, it feels monstrous, a society that treated desire as duty, love as liability. But to the Spartans, it was the ultimate expression of devotion to the collective. Their pursuit of strength was not evil in their eyes, it was sacred. That is what makes it so haunting. They believed they were building perfection. They never saw that in their quest to breed the strongest warriors, they were extinguishing the very thing that makes strength worth having: the capacity to feel. Spartan women lived under a paradox that defied the expectations of the ancient world. They were feared, admired, and envied, yet few truly understood the chains hidden beneath their freedom. To the outsider, a Spartan woman seemed powerful. She could own land, inherit wealth, and command slaves. She trained her body like a warrior, running, wrestling, and throwing javelins under the same sun as the men. Her voice was not silenced behind household walls. She could speak in public, manage estates, and even mock cowardly men who returned from battle alive when they should have died. But all of this freedom existed within invisible limits, carved by the will of the state. Her strength was not her own. It was borrowed, conditioned, and repurposed for Sparta's survival. From childhood, Girls were taught that their bodies were national property. They were to eat well, train hard, and grow strong so that their wombs might bear mighty sons. Beauty was secondary to function. Softness was a sin. Every exercise, every meal, every breath prepared them for a role they had not chosen, to become mothers of warriors. The Spartans believed that weak mothers produced weak children, so even women were subjected to a form of militarization. The games and physical contests they participated in were not for personal glory, but for the glory of the city. But what made Spartan women truly unique was their psychological training. They were not encouraged to be meek or subservient as in Athens or Corinth. Instead, they were taught pride, not in themselves, but in the system. A Spartan mother's love was redefined into something almost unrecognizable. When her son left for war, she handed him his shield and said, "Come back with it, or on it." That sentence was not poetry, it was doctrine. To mourn too loudly, to show too much grief, was weakness. The Spartan woman was expected to sacrifice emotion for the illusion of strength. Her heart was as disciplined as the soldier's sword. Inside her home, however, cracks began to appear. These women, intelligent and strong, were not blind to their circumstances. They knew that the state glorified their wombs while denying their hearts. Many of them lived alone for years, their husbands bound to the barracks until the age of 30. Nights were silent and long, and whispers of loneliness filled the city like ghosts. They managed their lands, raised their children, and waited, not for affection, but for duty to be fulfilled. There were whispers, too, of women who defied this order. Some formed quiet emotional bonds with others, men or women, that lay outside the sanction system. These acts of intimacy were small rebellions, sparks of humanity flickering in the dark. To love for one's own pleasure, to desire for one's own will, was to commit an unspoken crime against the Spartan way. And yet, even the most disciplined could not always silence the voice of nature. Beneath the iron facade, there pulsed a longing for softness, for freedom, for the right to feel. Historians tell us that Spartan women were both feared and desired by outsiders. Their confidence was intoxicating. Athenian men wrote bitterly about their independence, calling them arrogant and unfeminine. But what those men mistook for arrogance was survival. In a society where affection was forbidden and weakness punished, pride became armor. They learned to wield their words like weapons, to assert control in the only way they could, through intellect, wit, and presence. But make no mistake, even this power was permitted only because it served Sparta. Their land ownership ensured economic stability while their public presence inspired discipline among men. The illusion of freedom masked the reality of servitude. And yet, within these confines, Spartan women became the silent keepers of the city's soul. When the men were away at war, it was the women who kept Sparta functioning. They trained their daughters, managed resources, and enforced the code of discipline. It was they who whispered the laws into the ears of children, who reminded the young what it meant to be Spartan. They were the state's unacknowledged backbone, invisible but essential. Their strength was both genuine and tragic. Genuine because it shaped the greatest military power of the ancient world, and tragic because it came at the cost of their humanity. Psychologically, these women lived in constant tension. They were expected to be both tender and unfeeling, nurturing and ruthless. They were celebrated as mothers yet denied the right to love freely. The constant pressure to perform strength, to embody perfection, must have weighed heavily. It turned every act of emotion into a private sin. In the darkness of their rooms, when no eyes watched, perhaps some allowed themselves to remember what they were before the state claimed them. Perhaps they wept quietly not for their sons, but for the selves they had lost. But their silence should not be mistaken for submission. Within the cage of duty, some learned to manipulate the system that bound them. They arranged marriages, influenced political decisions, and guided the younger men through counsel and persuasion. Their authority was indirect, but real. Even the mightiest Spartan generals feared the words of their mothers. In this sense, the women of Sparta ruled from behind the veil, not with armies, but with intellect and will. They were both prisoners and queens, their power woven from obedience and defiance in equal measure. The legacy of these women is difficult to define. Were they victims of a cruel system or its secret masters? The truth lies somewhere in between. They upheld the very ideology that enslaved them, believing that through sacrifice they were serving something greater. Their strength was not freedom, but faith in the ideal of Sparta, in the god of discipline. And yet, that same faith condemned them to lives of emotional isolation. They became living monuments to a city that valued perfection over love. To look upon them now is to see both beauty and tragedy intertwined. They stood tall in a world that demanded submission. They spoke clearly in a culture that silenced women. But every step they took was dictated by the laws of a state that had stolen their right to be human. They were free only in the ways their masters allowed, proud, strong, unbroken, yet forever bound. In the end, the Spartan woman was not merely a figure of strength, she was a reflection of her civilization's deepest contradiction. She embodied power and servitude, glory and loss. Her freedom was a mask for control, her pride a shield against despair. And as she stood on the walls of the city, watching her sons march toward death, she did not cry. Because in Sparta, even grief had to serve the state. Passion was Sparta's most dangerous enemy. It was not an invading army or a rival city, but something invisible and uncontrollable, the power of desire. In a world built on restraint and obedience, love was treated as a form of treason. The Spartan state feared that emotional attachment could dissolve discipline, that tenderness could fracture the iron wall of loyalty every soldier was expected to maintain. To feel too deeply was to lose control, and control was the very essence of their existence. This section of the story brings us into the forbidden chambers of the Spartan soul, the private, secret rebellions that took place behind the mask of perfection. In the darkness of barracks and homes, forbidden bonds began to form. Men who spent their entire lives training and fighting side by side inevitably developed relationships that transcended mere camaraderie. The agoge, that merciless system of education, encouraged young warriors to idolize their elders, to form mentorship bonds meant to teach discipline and valor. Yet beneath that discipline, affection often bloomed. Many historians believe that same-sex relationships were not only tolerated but quietly encouraged within the military, as they forged emotional ties that strengthened unit cohesion. The irony was profound. The very society that forbade romantic attachment between men and women permitted, even celebrated, intimacy between warriors so long as it served the cause of strength. But what happened when those bonds grew into love? When affection threatened to eclipse loyalty? That was the line Sparta dared not cross. Soldiers who placed the heart above the city risked everything. The state did not care whom they loved, so long as that love did not become a reason to question obedience. But it always did. Love, after all, makes one human, and to be human in Sparta was to be flawed. The very emotions that gave life meaning were considered infections, signs of weakness that had to be purged before they spread. For women, the situation was even more complex. Their lives were designed around reproduction and duty, but the human heart is not so easily controlled. Some Spartan women formed quiet relationships with other women, drawn together by loneliness and shared captivity. Others fell for men who were not their assigned husbands, risking scandal and exile. To desire was to defy the state's design. To act on it was to challenge the gods themselves. These hidden romances, whether between men in barracks or women in lonely homes, were cracks in the city's armor. They revealed a truth the Spartans refused to admit, that even in a world ruled by steel, the heart still beats. Imagine the tension of such a life. A man who spent his days killing in the name of order, who lived among comrades, might one night allow himself to feel, to look across the fire and see not a fellow warrior, but a soul. A woman, trained to be stoic, might for a fleeting moment touch another's hand and remember that she is not just a mother or a vessel but a living being with a pulse and longing. These moments were small, hidden, and dangerous, but they were the last proof of humanity inside a society that had tried to erase it. The forbidden bonds of Sparta were not just physical, they were spiritual. They represented the instinct to connect, to love, to belong. This instinct could not be trained out of them, no matter how brutal their education or how sacred their obedience. It was the one thing the agoge could not destroy. The more Sparta tried to suppress it, the stronger it became. The walls they built to contain it only amplified its power, turning love into rebellion and desire into resistance. Every stolen glance, every whispered confession, every secret night became a quiet act of defiance against the state. Yet Sparta's leaders understood this danger all too well. They believed that passion distracted from purpose, that lovers made poor soldiers. So they turned love into mythology, something that existed only in the realm of gods and heroes, not men and women. In Spartan culture, the highest form of affection was not romantic, but patriotic. The greatest love was for the city itself. Even tenderness was redirected toward devotion to Sparta. Love your brothers, they taught, for they are your shields. But love your wife? Love your child? That was sentimental weakness. The state stood above all. And still, within this rigid order, the human need to love persisted. Some couples found ways to communicate their affection within the constraints. A look across the agora, a shared moment at the training fields, a secret gift. These gestures carried more emotion than the most passionate letters from other lands. Because in Sparta, where love was forbidden, even a glance could feel revolutionary. The emotional tension between repression and desire became the city's silent heartbeat. The consequences of such repression were enormous. Without space for tenderness, relationships warped into strange shapes. Husbands and wives learned to treat each other as distant partners in duty. Men learned to bury affection so deeply that it emerged only through violence or ritual. Women learned to confuse devotion with pride, mistaking their submission for honor. Over generations, this emotional suffocation shaped not only individuals but the destiny of the state itself. A society without softness cannot sustain itself. It can conquer, but it cannot create. It can inspire fear but not loyalty of the heart. And eventually, every empire built on fear must crumble. In this section, the contrast is clear: love and control, passion and discipline, nature and order. The Spartans tried to perfect humanity by erasing what made it human. Their forbidden bonds, whether whispered between soldiers or hidden in the shadows of women's homes, reveal the limits of power. They show that even in the most rigid system, emotion finds a way to breathe. For all their discipline, the Spartans could never conquer the simple truth that every human heart, even the most hardened, hungers to be known. This was Sparta's unspoken tragedy. It forged men who could endure unimaginable pain but could not bear vulnerability. It produced women who could raise warriors but were denied the right to be loved. Beneath the armor of strength lay an emptiness no law could fill. In their attempt to suppress passion, the Spartans created a society haunted by the very thing they feared most: the memory of what it meant to feel. Sparta's downfall did not happen suddenly, with flames and battle cries. It came slowly, like the withering of something that had already died inside long before the body collapsed. What destroyed Sparta was not an invading army or a failed campaign. It was its own perfection, its obsession with control, its fear of weakness, and its war against the human heart. A civilization built entirely on discipline and purity could not sustain the chaos of life itself. The same iron code that forged its greatness also forged its ruin. As the centuries passed, the strength that had once terrified the Greek world began to rot from within. The warrior class grew smaller, strangled by the very system that demanded purity of blood. Every law designed to preserve the perfect Spartan stock instead made it fragile. By forbidding outsiders to join their citizen ranks and by limiting marriage to equal-born pairs, the population shrank. Fewer births meant fewer soldiers. The once endless lines of hoplites, the pride of the Peloponnesus, became thin, their shields fewer each year. Sparta had sacrificed vitality for control, and control cannot breed. The economy, too, began to crumble. The Helots, the enslaved underclass that worked the land, grew restless. They had always outnumbered their Spartan masters by 10 to 1, kept in check only by terror. But as Spartan numbers dwindled, that balance tipped. Rebellions flared like brush fires across the countryside. The citizens who once dominated through fear now lived in fear themselves. The warriors who were trained to show no emotion began to taste the bitterness of panic. And yet, their laws did not change. They could not. To adapt would have been to admit weakness, and to a Spartan, that was worse than death. The women of Sparta, once the fierce matriarchs who upheld discipline, found themselves surrounded by silence. There were fewer sons to send to war, fewer husbands to manage, fewer reasons to live by the old creeds. Some historians describe a city filled with widows and childless mothers, women who had once ruled the estates but now wandered through hollow streets, haunted by memories of glory. The ritual of strength had outlived its purpose. The mighty Spartan machine had devoured its own future. Psychologically, the fall of Sparta was inevitable. A society that denies emotion cannot survive the centuries. Its citizens lose the ability to create, to dream, to evolve. Sparta produced soldiers but never artists. It built warriors but never thinkers. Its walls were not of stone but of ideology, and such walls always collapse from the inside. While Athens filled the world with ideas, literature, and democracy, Sparta remained frozen, unable to adapt. When change came, it shattered them like a sword dropped on stone. Even their military supremacy, the foundation of their identity, began to crumble. At Leuctra in 371 BCE, the Thebans, once considered inferior, defeated Sparta in open battle. For the first time in centuries, the invincible phalanx broke. The Spartan line, that perfect formation of shields and discipline, wavered and fell. It was more than a military defeat, it was a psychological implosion. The illusion of divine strength was gone. Sparta's soldiers had been trained to die rather than fail, but they had never been taught how to live after losing. When the battlefield no longer defined them, their society lost its meaning. In the years that followed, the city fell into decay. The once proud laws of Lycurgus became hollow recitations of tradition. The agoge continued, but fewer boys entered it. The barracks echoed with absence. The rituals that had once kept the city strong now chained it to death. And as their population dwindled, Sparta turned inward, suspicious, paranoid, desperate to preserve what little purity remained. It was a slow suffocation, the kind that leaves no heroic last stand, only silence. What makes the fall of Sparta so haunting is not its political collapse, but its moral one. The system had promised eternal greatness through discipline and denial, yet it ended in sterility and despair. The same culture that demanded mothers suppress grief and fathers suppress love ultimately produced a people incapable of hope. Without emotion, there can be no future. Without compassion, no unity. A society that fears love will inevitably destroy itself. And yet, there is tragedy in this fall, not mockery. For the Spartans were not monsters. They were human beings caught in the grip of their own ideals. They believed that perfection required sacrifice, that purity demanded pain. They thought they were protecting their civilization from decay, not creating it. Theirs was a slow suicide carried out in the name of strength. And in their fall lies a warning to all civilizations, that obsession with control leads only to ruin, and that a world without tenderness cannot endure. When travelers came to Sparta centuries later, they found only ruins, broken temples, empty training grounds, and silent homes. The wind still moved through the valley, carrying faint echoes of marching feet and whispered commands. Somewhere in that silence, one could almost hear the voices of women singing lullabies to children who would never grow up to fight. The iron heart of Sparta had turned to dust, and yet its legend lived on, not as a tale of triumph, but as a cautionary hymn to the cost of perfection. The fall of Sparta is more than history, it is psychology carved in stone. It shows that cruelty cannot sustain itself, that control eventually consumes its creator. Their story is the story of every society that tries to replace emotion with order, faith with fear, humanity with discipline. For a time, they conquered the world through strength, but they could not conquer themselves. In the end, Sparta died not from invasion, but from emptiness. Its walls did not crumble from siege engines, but from the silence of hearts that had forgotten how to love. What began as the pursuit of immortality ended in extinction. The city that once made gods of men left behind nothing but ruins, and the echo of a single, eternal truth, that no civilization can survive the death of its own soul. The story of Sparta does not end with the clash of swords or the roar of armies. It ends in silence, a silence heavy with the ghosts of discipline, of love denied, of lives sacrificed to an impossible ideal. The fires that once burned in Spartan hearths have long turned to ash, but their story continues to haunt us because it is not merely a tale of the past. It is a mirror, a reflection of humanity's oldest temptation, to control what cannot be controlled, to perfect what was never meant to be perfect. Sparta's greatest tragedy was not its fall, but what it became before it fell, a society that confused fear for strength and obedience for virtue. The image of the Spartan bride remains the most haunting emblem of this civilization. Head shaved, eyes downcast, she waits in darkness for a man who will not speak to her, for a night that is not her own. Around her, silence hums like an echo of war. She is neither wife nor woman, but symbol, her body a tool, her emotions forbidden. To the Spartans, she was not a victim but a vessel of virtue, her submission proof of her strength. They saw holiness in her obedience, beauty in her silence. But beneath that silence lies something deeper, something timeless, the cost of surrendering the soul for the sake of the state. She was the first casualty of Sparta's perfection. Her story is not merely about one night or one city, it is about what happens when humanity is redefined by power. The Spartans believed they were purifying the human race, forging something stronger than flesh and desire. They wanted to create a world immune to weakness, a world of warriors who could not feel pain because they could not feel love. But in erasing tenderness, they erased life itself. The irony of Sparta is that in trying to conquer mortality, it made itself sterile. A society that outlawed vulnerability could not reproduce its spirit, only its shadow. As centuries passed, the world around Sparta changed. Empires rose and fell, philosophies evolved, and art flourished in neighboring lands. Athens sculpted beauty, wrote tragedy, and debated democracy. Persia built palaces that touched the heavens. Even distant tribes learned to balance war and peace. But Sparta remained frozen in its own perfection, unmoved, unchanging, untouched by the pulse of life. Its laws forbade expansion of the mind. Its culture forbade expansion of the heart. The same discipline that once made it powerful became its prison. Psychologically, the fall of Sparta reveals something universal about the human condition. We are drawn to control, to mastery, to order, to predictability. Yet the essence of life is chaos, love, creation, decay, renewal. The Spartans could not accept that contradiction. They tried to build a world without chaos, without uncertainty, and thus without life. Their tragedy is the tragedy of every system that tries to suppress emotion in pursuit of perfection. When love is outlawed, fear becomes the only emotion left. And fear, when institutionalized, consumes everything. Still, we continue to romanticize them. Even now, thousands of years later, we admire the Spartan ideal, their discipline, their sacrifice, their unity. Movies glorify their stoicism, fitness gurus invoke their endurance, politicians quote their laws as examples of national strength. But what we glorify is only half the story. We see the bronze and the muscle, but not the silence behind it. We see the courage in battle, but not the emptiness in the heart. The modern world repeats Sparta's mistake, confusing control with greatness, efficiency with virtue. We build societies that value productivity over empathy, power over compassion, image over humanity. Sparta's ghost lives on, not in ruins, but in the way we still fear softness. The legacy of Sparta should not inspire imitation, but reflection. It forces us to ask, what is strength truly? Is it the ability to suppress pain, or the courage to feel it? The Spartans believed strength meant domination, over others, over the self, over nature. But real strength lies in the opposite, in acceptance, in vulnerability, in the willingness to face the chaos of existence without trying to cage it. The Spartan system was designed to kill that truth. It trained its people to conquer everything, except themselves. The most tragic part of their story is that their ideals worked, for a time. They did create the strongest warriors, the most disciplined citizens, the most efficient society. But it was too perfect to endure. When strength becomes an end in itself, it eats its own foundations. The same values that lifted Sparta above the world also buried it beneath the weight of its own demands. The children of discipline became prisoners of fear. The women who were praised for power were denied love. The men who were trained to die for glory forgot how to live in peace. Their perfection was their curse. In this, there is a warning for all civilizations, and for every human heart. When we glorify strength without compassion, we repeat Sparta's mistake. When we value order more than empathy, when we praise silence over emotion, when we build systems that punish weakness instead of healing it, we resurrect the same walls that once surrounded that ancient city. The Spartan way did not vanish, it merely evolved. It exists in every place where people are taught to bury feeling beneath duty, to hide pain behind pride, to obey without understanding. And yet, within that darkness, something human always survived. Even in Sparta, the heart found ways to breathe. In the whispers between lovers, in the quiet tears of mothers, in the forbidden tenderness of brothers in arms, humanity endured. The city could command bodies, but it could never command the soul. The Spartan bride's silent hope, her tiny, invisible rebellion, is proof of that. She waited not only for her husband, but for the faint promise that one day, love would no longer be a sin. That promise echoes through time. It reminds us that even in the harshest systems, the seed of compassion cannot die. The ruins of Sparta may be silent, but silence is not death. It is the pause before reflection. It asks us to listen, not to the clanging of armor or the speeches of kings, but to the quieter sound, the heartbeat of the woman who waited in the dark and dared to dream of tenderness in a city that had outlawed it. Standing among those ruins today, one can almost hear her. The wind moves through the broken stones like a whisper from another age. Remember us, but remember truly. Do not remember only our glory, remember our grief. Do not remember our power without our pain. Remember the price we paid for perfection. For in that memory lies the warning and the hope of what it means to be human. Because Sparta's story is not only about what was lost, but what remains. It teaches that no matter how much a society suppresses the heart will find a way to rise again. Empires collapse, laws crumble, ideologies fade, but love endures, quiet, patient, immortal. The Spartan bride, once stripped of her identity, stands now as a symbol of something greater than Sparta itself. She represents the truth that cannot be destroyed, that even in a world of iron, the soul still remembers how to feel. In the end, the lights of Sparta went out, but the question it left behind still burns. Is strength worth the loss of compassion? The answer lies not in ruins or history books, but in us. Every time we choose empathy over pride, tenderness over control, we defy the same darkness that once ruled that ancient city. The Spartans sought to purify humanity. Instead, they revealed its greatest truth, that imperfection is not weakness, but life itself. And so the story closes as it began, with a woman in the dark, her head bowed, her heart still beating. The world around her may demand silence, but within her, a new strength stirs, not the strength to fight, but to feel. In that quiet defiance lies the true legacy of Sparta, and the eternal triumph of the human heart.